The air screamed. The redcap stopped. It rolled off of Reimu's chest. Reimu! Dion screamed again. Reimu's eyes rolled first to the corpse. An arrow jutted through the shattered plate armor. Reimu was struck, not by the redcap, but by a breath and the recognition of his freedom. He sprung to his feet, defensively posed with a scimitar again clasped in each hand. The sound of his unicorn's fretful whinny wheeled Reimu's gaze back over his shoulder. The cream-colored steed was rearing up, kicking to wrestle free from the clutches of a rabid redcap, wading waist-deep in the sand under the hooves. One slice severed both arms just below the elbow. The sand was muddied with the gorilla's spurting blood. The flailing stub sprayed indiscriminately, staining the unicorn's buckskin coat and washing in streams down the contours of Reimu's face. The redcap screamed, distracted at the sight of its own blood. Reimu did not waste the distraction. He stepped into the stirrup and leapt into the saddle. He drove his mount to make a quick pivot, which both crushed the skull of the redcap at the hooves and gave Reimu a chance to make a survey of their escape. His immediate reaction was to ride to the others, but there were no others. Everyone had scattered, painting the desert with lonely abandon. He would have to catch up. They would all have to catch up. But to whom were they to catch up? Every distant ally was being preyed upon. The closest recognized face was the one he knew best, the one whom had shot pleading glances at him between each shot from his bow. "Hurry, Reimu!" Dion shouted. Reimu was ready to race to the archer, but was stalled by the scene developing before him. Beside the half-exhumed redcap carcass that wallowed in a pool of its own blood squatted a second fiend. It curled its toes in the muddy sand. It patted at the ruddy pool and clapped blooded handprints on its cheeks. The rhythms of its panting and bobbing grew more fervent. The redcap threw itself face first into the sanguine slurry, nudging and rutting so hard that its bandana was eventually scraped from its brow. Reimu kept his gaze fixed on the scene as he bade his mount into a slow retreat. The redcap lifted the sopping kerchief to wash its face. It reset the scarf on its brow and, refreshed, lifted its gaze to meet Reimu's. It barked with glee. Reimu kicked and charged off. Dion let his arrow fly, catching the goblin through its blood-stained cap. The fencer raced past the archer, who quickly caught up. "You're welcome," Dion shouted. The sound of his comrade's voice settled Reimu's nerves enough to joke. "You still owe me." "All right, see if I save you again," Dion sneered mockingly. Poise returned to their exchange when there came a shrill bark from anywhere. Karen flinched at the sound, which was as tactile as melting ice weeping down her back. Each scream haunted her with its familiar nuance, as though she had heard them before, although they would not be placed. There were no words, only an inflection. They were distressed and distressing. It was not a foreign language, but did communicate something. They bore no resemblance to a warding bark. These were not the ravings of lunacy. These were wails, despondent, despairing, trembling with realization. Karen knew better than to listen, but could not stop her sympathy from hearing the appeals. Did they seek to ease some pain? Were they pangs of hunger? Had the desert parched their curiosity into some ennui, and was she the distraction for which they longed? Resonance turned to shivers at a crescendo of horrifying possibilities. This was the only language the redcaps knew, the only language they had ever heard. These were a hollow mockery of their victims' last screams. These were echoes of the dying, familiar because they were human voices, wailing to get away and thrashing in pain. Pity and disgust stirred her own screams until they could be choked back no more. Her voice erupted from her heaving chest. She flailed her lance at the swarming monsters, battling back their attempt to encroach. She had to gasp. Her scream waned. The redcaps found some new delight in her fading cry. They smiled their crooked smiles, and as they posed to pounce, they lifted their voices in a cacophony of echoes. The sound of her voice, screaming back at her, triggered darker thoughts. Instinct recognized the sound immediately, and she bristled, knowing that they might take her dying screams. How dare they steal from her? No, if they wanted her voice, then they would have to take it with every sentiment she had ever expressed. All of her rage and fear and sorrow and rant swelled into one note. Let them share this one battle cry. She joined in their chorus. Now her cry was the infectious one. They had imbibed a fragment of her, but with it came a sympathetic bond that she could manipulate. Every redcap who had mimicked her wail suddenly fell, coughing up the blooded fragments of larynx that had cracked under her cursed resonance. One warbled cry was not choked. She knew that voice, despite its fretful timbre. It was one that she had spoken with, had reasoned with. She turned toward his screams. The redcap pounced. It was too late for Karen to block its rotting poleaxe. She lifted her lance ready to die, landing her own strike. The air howled, and the wide-eyed gawk of the redcap grew empty. The poleaxe slipped from its fingers. The redcap crashed against Karen. For a moment, Karen wrestled against the redcap, expecting to have to untangle its greedy hands from her body. Instead, it slid from her shoulder and crumbled into a heap on the sand beside her unicorn. The shaft of a javelin jutted from between its shoulders, the iron point planted firmly in its spine. Karen traced the shaft to whence it had been hurled. Shem was not far off, pulling his next javelin from a quiver strapped to his saddle. Karen raced to his side, but it had not been Shem's husky baritone that she had heard. It was not Shem's wail mimicked by the redcap. "Daryl needs you," Shem cried out as the major approached. "Help him get us out of here." "Where is Simon?" Karen plowed over Shem's request. Nasu's stoic posture, mounted on the alabaster corsair, belied the cause of the gorilla's sudden incapacitation. He sat quietly in his saddle, more reflective of, and less reactive to, the combatants shifting around him, not minding their approach or retreat, but simply studying as they whirled around him like sand in the wind. Neither blinked eye nor waved hand indicted him of meddling, but their sadistic attempts were repeatedly spoiled. Their distressing barks choked in their throats, muting the frenzied echoes. A halberd slashed at the vizier, but fell limp without even scratching his silk robe. A nervous shudder ran the length of the redcap's spine, flooding the whites of its eyes and further straining its already gaping gawk. Muscles stuttered and then convulsed, and soon grew knotted with paralyzing cramps that pried open the bony fists that once held the spear. The thighs clenched, and the knees buckled, and the goblin collapsed over its weapon, writhing against the tension within its tendons. Sclerosis had poured over every ligament, cementing the tissue and sealing the redcap in the inescapable prison of its own body, abandoned and exposed on the baking sand under a blistering desert morning. It did not take a moment, not even a shift in gaze, for Nasu to notice the next assailant. A simmering under the skin distracted the approaching redcap. Its eyes, which once weighed hungrily on Nasu, began to twitch and roll. The spear was dropped to swat at the bristling swarm crawling up its neck, over its chin, and across its cheeks. Nests inside the redcap's pores hurched larval distractions that writhed under the skin. They squirmed to extract themselves and carved out crannies where they could bed and fester. The consumed redcap raked its cracked nails across its sun-beaten skin, fervently picking at the burrowing until blood trailed down its stripped face. Immediately the redcap was tackled. The blood dripping from its face and fingernails had caught the delights of some other redcap, who wrestled for any chance to further pry apart the wounds and tap the body for more blood. Nasu watched. "Nasu!" The vizier turned to the call of his name. Karen raced toward him, shouting, "Where is Simon? We cannot find Simon." Nasu's quiet reflection grew conscious and dark. The observant arch in his brow furrowed into a scowl, and violently he turned his gaze side to side, combing the panorama for any sight of his squire. Karen heard his gasp. "No!" It was surreal the way the hind quarters of the gray speckled destrier kicked and jumped, lashing to catch the floor that had been stolen from beneath its hooves. Gravel churned around the saddle's cinch as the desert munched on the torso, slowly sucking the steed deeper under the crust. Its head and shoulders were long buried, so only the most patient ear could discern its muffled screams over the clatter of battle and the scratching of its hooves against the sand. The blue-tasseled ornamentation on the saddle identified the destrier as one from the clerical order. A stream of footprints pooled near the tripped unicorn, but there were no familiar boots to stomp the prints in the sand. Its rider was long gone. "Karen, go." Nasu's tone was barren. "Get out of here," he finally shouted, and swatted at her. His motion startled her conscious, awake from the flooding nightmare that was drowning her rational thoughts. She realized where she was and where she needed to be. Kicked spurs drove her unicorn on. Nesu waited for Shem and Reimu, the last of the scattered coterie, to pass him, and he took up the rear as they all raced after the escaping prince. Draco's senses had filtered back into him, but the stain of guilt for his momentary lapse now tainted his whole self-image. It was a heavy burden, and added to the weight he already carried for dragging them this far toward their death. He had assigned their mission. He had chosen their path. Now this responsibility crowned his regrets, and the load was too much to bear. Racing down the ridge which Darrell had once hoped to capture was the most immediate threat to their escape. A band of redcaps, spears at the ready, sent to cut off any last runaways. These were the killers of the Pride, the stalkers who waited to pick off those who had escaped being rounded up. The desert before Draco was a vacant plain. They could find their way again once they were safe in that distant, featureless expanse of drifting sand. He could see it. He waved his sword in the air and signaled their heading. They could see it. That was their goal. He need lead them no further. With a swift jerk on his reins, Draco peeled away from the others and let them pass. He rode back to intercept the pursuing redcaps. "Draco, no!" Nesu screamed. Terracon turned back, the only one who seemed to have heard Nesu's cry. Eloise fussed, clamoring to escape, but Terracon ignored her, and shortly she saw why. Draco was a massive warlock, who had trained skills that the knights and the other orders could only dream to have. 3 centuries of practice had sculpted a warrior that was an honor to the Order of Valish and to the House of Hexen. In one swipe of his longsword, which he miraculously navigated with only one hand, he rent off the head of the first redcap. A thrust spear skid off his tilted shield to reveal the thrusted point of his sword. An arc of blood splattered the desert as Draco hacked at the next assailant. In that distraction, the redcaps found their one moment of reprisal. 2 rusted halberds hooked the shield with their back-turned barbs and tugged the prince off balance. Draco turned to fight, but was tackled from behind by a 3rd redcap. Draco was knocked from his saddle. The destrier raced away. Draco was glad. He had room to fight now. He sacrificed his shield, which threw off the footing of the 2 pikemen. The 3rd that had tackled him was thrown. The dark clouds of Draco's guilt had brooded long enough, and now rage and fury were tearing through him in a storm of emotions that could find release nowhere except in the enemy on which he was wholly focused. The redcap was still in the arc of its fall, thrown from Draco's shoulder, when the emotional storm blistered a bolt that crashed the body out of its trajectory and straight into the sand below. The thunderclap, a sound so utterly alien to this landscape, whose heavens had not changed since the infancy of recorded time, called to attention every ear that heard it. It brayed louder than the terror that consumed the knights, and made them turn back against all better judgment to see what had happened. It rattled the remaining redcaps out of their frenzy and into such a deep state of selfish preservation that they cowered close to the sand. Those too near the conflict had been struck dumb, leaving Draco alone standing. As the resonation faded, so did its effects. Slowly the redcaps climbed up to face the prince again. Draco would not be at their mercy this time, however. His sword had not rested during the aftershock. He had planted his blade in every body, still or not, that was scattered around him. He drew up the blood-dripping blade. His enemy's eyes gazed transfixed on its sanguine wash. That sword was no longer a threat, but a blessing, baptized in a thick red lacquer. Greed glistened in those thieving eyes. Draco granted it to them. The blade hacked the nearest redcap apart. Draco turned around to face a scream and sliced a pouncing goblin out of the air. His spare hand found the handle and drove the sword down the throat of an oncoming gorilla. Draco stomped to reestablish his weight, cracking the desert's crust like thin ice to send a rupturing fissure underfoot of a fast-approaching redcap. It tripped on the quaking furrow and was stilled by the edge of Draco's longsword. Draco stood, posed defensively over the baking corpses. His armor heaved with every heavy pant. He waited, armed against any assailant. He waited. The desert was quiet. He waited. He let his gaze slip further and further through the distance until he saw Nesu and Terracon and Eloise mounted on his escaped unicorn. He peeled off his great helm and was struck by how cool the desert air felt against his brow. His cheeks were flushed. His sweat-matted hair was plastered to the contours of his face. He dragged his sword against the desert, drawing a line in the sand beside his footprints as he trudged his way toward the others, eventually breaking into a quicker jog. Then the desert opened. "Draco!" Nesu screamed too late. Desiccated hands had latched their knobby fingers around Prince Draco's ankles, and he crashed to his hands and knees. He pivoted to look back and kicked at the knuckles. The sands beneath one wrist gave in, sinking Draco's arm to the shoulder. The gravel slipped and sipped beneath his knees, and Draco fell under. Only his one hand, with his fingers raking the crust, anchored him enough to keep him from completely drowning in the sand. His wide eyes pleaded as he looked to the vizier. Nesu raced closer. Terracon and Eloise were shortly behind. "No!" Nesu slowed when he realized the two were behind him. "Stay back!" Nesu and Draco exchanged their pleads through silent, quivering lips and desperate glances. Nesu offered his hand, but was irrationally too distant to really be of any aid. The sand beneath Draco's fingers gave way. The prince's hand did not clamor for some other grip, but instead he opened his palm achingly toward the vizier. Static teased at the hairs dusted across Terracon's wrist. A vacant space, hungry to be filled, left a swelling vertigo to rush through the captain, and he felt himself be drawn toward the nothing floating between Nesu and Draco. Their desperation and loneliness suffocated the air with a heavy, weighted mood, a sorrow so thick that it was almost tactile. Draco had slipped, but had not drowned. He was hanging on, holding tightly to Nesu's loss. He was suspended in a limbo where every movement that did not draw him closer to the vizier's side chipped his hope away. Sorrow could not tow him out of the Redcap's hands, however. Moments passed, and Draco could only pull against the sands draining around him, draining through time's hourglass. Draco passed a longing glance to Nesu once more before his hand fell below the surface. The vizier's resolve could not be lost as quickly as Draco's. Nesu was certain he could reach Draco's hand in the shallows of the sand. The loss Nesu's heart felt as the fingers slipped beneath the sands cracked the shell of patience that the vizier had tempered so well, and the rampage leaked onto his breath as he screamed out to Draco once more. The emotional chaos bled into the air, kicking and beating it, and tossing up winds that howled with all of Nesu's fury. The gusts curled and pitched and drilled into the dusty plain. The patch of sand where Draco once stood was scooped out by the gusts. The whirling winds burrowed into the ground, luring up streams of gravel to drain a pit over the prince's grave. Nesu's robes were being torn from his shoulder, yet he could not hear them beating over the deafening howl of his heartbreak in the wind. His hands were numb from the stones and sand pelted at him by the gusts, yet nothing could permeate the emptiness inside. Choked tears blotted his sight, and still he stared into the excavated hollow. The sands were swept back from the fingers of Draco's armor-plated leather gauntlet, which reached toward the dust-clouded sky. Nesu's curiosity grew frantic, and the winds more furious. They drove faster, deeper. The fingers flickered to life, curling, grasping. Then a gust tore up the glove and tossed it into the tornado of sand. It was just an empty glove, flaccid and flopping. Nesu's heart was empty. The screaming heartbreak in the wind whined into a whimper. The tornado of sand waned away. The storm of sand that had stained the sky now rained grains and gravel until the zenith was returned to the desert's typical empty azure. The prince's empty glove crashed into the sand only a few steps ahead of the vizier. "Draco!" Terracon screamed. "No!" He kicked Ramses, but Nesu was quick to snatch the reins and pull the unicorn back. Nesu grabbed Terracon's wrist and said, "Let us go." "No, no, let me go. We have to rescue him," Terracon shouted. Nesu jerked on the captain's wrist, and Terracon turned his gaze back to the vizier. "Stop it, boy. There is no point," Nesu commanded. His eyes burned furiously. "Besides, Cassandra is more important." "But Nesu, we cannot trade one for the other. Osmara will not forgive us. He will not forgive us," Terracon ranted. "I told you, offer them what you can and make peace with your shortcomings. You were forgiven the first time you rescued Osmara. Some of us will never know that peace. You cannot save them, but you can still save the princess. You can still save us. Now hurry, Nesu shouted and wheeled his pale unicorn around. Draco. Tarakon's voice could barely break out from within him. Draco. His emotions drained like the sand. Tarakon turned away.